Yeah, there's been a tendency amongst American evangelicals to assume that C.S. Lewis very much fits within that larger Reformed evangelical tradition. A bit of the history of that goes back to the 1950s. Billy Graham was over in England and visited C.S. Lewis. Billy Graham comes out of the Wheaton College tradition, and post-Billy Graham, Clyde Kilby was very interested in C.S. Lewis and those who surrounded Lewis, and through Wheaton College, Clyde Kilby and others, much of the writings of Lewis and the other Inklings and those surrounding what was called the Seven were brought to Wheaton College, which is many see as the Vatican of the Evangelicals, or the Harvard of the Evangelicals. As a result of this, what has occurred historically is that within the American evangelical Reformed tradition, because of the bridge between England and the States of C.S. Lewis, there's been a tendency to think that C.S. Lewis is a standard bearer of American Reformed evangelical thought. Usually what happens is they pick a variety of they go cherry picking with a variety of his works, such as Chronicles of Narnia, Abolition of Man, some of the Space Trilogy, often the Apologetics, Mere Christianity, his work on miracles. And so there are certain texts which are selected by Lewis which seem to fit within that broader evangelical tradition, which is shaped and formed largely through a Calvinist tradition. Now, would C.S. Lewis fit within that? Of course, C.S. Lewis wouldn't fit in the American evangelical tradition for a variety of reasons. C.S. Lewis comes from a very pronounced Catholic Anglican background. Interesting enough, though many from Wheaton and others turned to the Episcopal Church from some free church tradition as a result of their engagement with C.S. Lewis. But Lewis's Anglicanism, or Church of England background, is very grounded in a classical patristic heritage. He wrote forewords to Athanasius's work on the Incarnation. He knew Dionysius inside out, the discarded image. He looks at this great classical tradition of Western thought and how Christianity has synthesized that. And in fact, Lewis saw with the coming to be of the Reformation the dimming and thinning out of Christianity, particularly through Calvinism and the Lutheran tradition. In his great work on English literature, excluding grammar, he sees the high point in terms of the English Renaissance of Hooker and Shakespeare and the Elizabethan tradition, of which Erasmus and More come a little earlier in this tradition. And so this classical Catholic tradition, which has so infused and shaped historic Anglican tradition, is very different from the Calvinism and then the evangelical heritage, which is latched onto Calvin in terms of defining itself in that way. So can C.S. Lewis be seen honestly, faithfully, and consistently as an American evangelical? Of course not. But you can go cherry-picking certain texts of Lewis that make him seem to fit within that. Lewis has served functionally a purpose for American evangelicals in that there was not a strong intellectual tradition within that heritage, and he, in coming along and giving lectures on the BBC and other things like this, he put forward a view of Christianity that could articulate a perspective of faith that could meet the major objections of some of the most thoughtful and rigorous challenges to Christianity. And so that was very helpful for many evangelicals who had, many of them under fundamentalism, retreated from the public fray. Lewis was a very public figure in England, giving the leading lectures, as I mentioned, in BBC and other things like this. His published works were considered, whether at Oxford or Cambridge or elsewhere, at the highest caliber and level. And so he became a model and a mentor and a master for many, in many ways, in terms of how Reformed and evangelicals, particularly in the United States and Canada, could enter the public fray once again in a thoughtful, informed, and persuasive manner. But when you actually get to the content of Lewis's theology, his philosophy, his views of literary criticism, literature, of fantasy, of writing, it doesn't fit within, broadly speaking, the historic Reformed tradition and then the evangelical, a wing of the evangelical tradition which draws from the Reformed Calvinist tradition. I should say that there's two great traditions within the evangelical tradition when it does theology. One is the Reformed Calvinist, the other is much more the Arminian tradition. Unfortunately, the Calvinist tradition has become the Neo-Sanhedrin, and those who don't genuflect to that particular position are often seen as denying the authentic evangelical heritage. But works like by Donald Dayton and many others like this have pointed out that there's the strong, and you get it in Wesley as well, the strong Arminian tradition as well. You get it in the holiness movements, Pentecostal traditions, certain elements of the renewal tradition that would see themselves evangelical, but they're not Calvinist in that sense. And so C.S. Lewis is, in brief, you could say he was very much a Catholic Anglican with sympathies towards orthodoxy, sympathies towards the Roman Catholic tradition, but had certain profound suspicions of Calvinism and particularly populist evangelical tradition.